Sholem Aleichem, ich bin Daniel Galay, Vorsitzender von Levikois. Ich freue sich sehr, was Sie sind gekommen zu mir. Es ist ein Vergnügen, zu oben bei uns in dem Moment in Israel, Dr. Roy Ginsberg, Doktor in Geschichte, in Kunst, in Jiddisch. Wird verbinden Kunst und Geschichte im Sowjetverband. Und ist jung. Und das allein und der Fakt, was forscht, das Thema, was hat er historischen Badeit, ist sehr wichtig für uns. Es ist, wir haben im Land mehr wie 1 Million angekommene vom Rattenverband, aber sicher als auch mehr, ja, einzutage. Und die dosige Geschichte von Rattenverband, von den Jiden im Rattenverband und später sehr Befreiung, ja, das ist ein Teil von unserer Geschichte. Und der Fakt, was Roy forscht, ist, das gibt uns eine Möglichkeit, sich reintiefen in was ist geschehen mit unserer Poesie, mit unserer Kunst. Und wird zu neu bin beide Sachen, die Kunst und der Poesie von jenen Jahren. Bin ich sehr glücklich, als tut es. In dem Moment befindet sich in Israel. Macht sein Postdoctorat und wir wünschen ihm größeres Loch. Wie ihr wisst, wird reden auf Englisch. Will ich euch sagen, ein Wort auf Englisch. Roy Ginsberg is doing his postdoctorate now in Tel Aviv University, and we are very happy that he's with us, and he's giving this lecture this time in English, and I hope that it will attract new audiences. His theme is Depictions of Industrial Utopia, Monumental Aesthetics in Soviet-Yiddish Art and Poetry between the years 1922 and 1937. Roy. Good, Mireimon. Roy, I have a pleasure to present you. I talked a little bit about you, and we are very eager to listen to you and to study from your research and findings. Please.
Okay, großen Dank, and thank you, Daniel, Miriam, everyone else associated with Levick House, and everyone in attendance who has come to see this Zoom talk, Zoom lecture titled Depictions of Industrial Utopia, Monumental Aesthetics in Soviet-Yiddish Art and Poetry from the years 1922 to 1937. Interestingly, on this first slide, you can see I start off with something that was published by Beginning Dawn, a Yiddish literary journal in Kyiv in 1919. And basically the years are just because the Soviet Union wasn't formally created until 1922. But as you will see over the course of this presentation, the forces, the policies, and the collective goals that drew Yiddish writers, sculptors, and other culturalists to the Soviet Union started really right during the Bolshevik Revolution and the Civil War, the pogroms, the population movements that happened in the immediate aftermath. As a background to this research, it's based on my current book project, which currently does not have a title, though this Depictions of Industrial Utopia is one that I hope will be an appropriate one. And the goals for this project are basically to situate the legacies of Yiddish texts and artworks, artworks being creations by Jewish culturalists in the Soviet Union who once illustrated Yiddish poetry volumes, literary journals, etc., and to place them within the context of Soviet and also Jewish cultural history. So there's been a trend where usually it's one or the other, where an artist like Iosif Chaikov is studied, is looked at through a Soviet lens or a Yiddish Jewish historical lens, but never looking at the two in the sort of the same the same study. This work will validate what I consider to be largely forgotten Soviet Yiddish works, full significance at the time of their creation, and to reveal new understandings about their legacy, both in contemporary culture across the former Soviet Union and beyond, as Daniel said, in Israel, in the United States, really anywhere where there's still movements to define Jewish cultural identity in a Jewish aesthetic movement, whether it be in Yiddish, Hebrew, English, French, or any other language. And finally, I hope to uncover what I consider to be monumental works of Soviet Yiddish art and literature, and determine how they continue to embody the initial industrial utopian idealism of writers like Peretz Markish, artists like Iosif Chaikov, and film directors like Abram Rom, and the others who contributed to this development of a Soviet Jewish ideology of industrialism. So the works that I examined were produced by writers and artists who were largely influenced by the wave of avant-garde movements that spread across Eastern Europe during the 1910s, by poets like Vladimir Mayakovsky, artists like Natalia Goncharova and El Lissitzky, who, though also dabbled in Yiddish art, was largely remembered as a Soviet constructivist and for his propaganda works. And basically, to determine these trends that brought these Soviet Yiddish artists to create this new cultural movement, and how it was, how this movement was inspired by this early Eastern European avant-garde wave that brought futurism, suprematism, and constructivism to Eastern Europe and later to the Soviet Union. So this brings me to the first image that I'm going to talk about. It's the cover illustration by Iosif Chaikov for the literary journal Beginning, or Dawn, which was published in Kyiv in 1919. It was published by the Yiddish Sektia of the All-Ukrainische Literarische Komitee. And the drawing features, as you can see, a muscular figure standing outside the threshold of a shtetl home. The figure's face is divided. Its right side contains lips and a single dreary shaded eye. The left side is completely blank, devoid of any discernible features. At the time, it was common for Jewish modernist artists to depict their Jewish subject with one eye open to the future and the other closed to the past. In Chaikov's illustration, the figure gazes eastward, but a black plane blocks him from the rising sun. The man blows a shofar, the instrument associated with the high holiday liturgy and biblically used to ready troops for battle. In Joshua 6, the shofar's blows topple the walls of Jericho and allows the Israelites to capture the city, the first step in their conquest of Canaan. The captioning accompanying the illustration displays in Yiddish print, "Proletarians from all lands unite, Proletariater von alle Länder vereinigt sich." Altogether, this illustration, the title, the shtetl scene, and the Marxist motto resemble an Orn Kodesh, the Holy Ark, the ornamental cabinet in which the Torah scrolls are housed in a synagogue. In East Europe, it was customary to place the Ark on the eastern wall so the congregation would pray towards Jerusalem. However, for Chaikov's audience, Moscow replaces Jerusalem as the place of longing. The Orn Kodesh, the most ornate feature of the synagogue, draws congregants' attention toward the Torah scrolls. Similarly, Chaikov's illustration pulls the viewer toward the journal's contents, the poems, stories, and essays from Ukraine's increasingly socialist Yiddish writers. Within the illustration itself, all Jewish markers are repurposed to serve the proletarian cause, reassigning the roles of the symbols of the famous Joshua 6 biblical tale. The shofar blasts not to call the Jews only, but all workers, and it is not the walls of Jericho that the figure seeks to topple, but the walls of the shtetl and the capitalist factory alike. As the Battle of Jericho was the first thought in the Israelites' conquest of Canaan, Chaikov presents the destruction of the shtetl as the first step in the proletarian struggle to claim their homeland. The first poem to appear in the journal is David Hofstein's Stadt, or City. I have pictured the first couple of lines from this poem. I'll read about the first 8 or so. Stadt, du hast mich von Weitem gerufen, mit Häudchen von Draht. Ich hab ständig auf Berg dich gesehen. Du hast mich von Weitem gezogen mit Zwangen. Von Schein und von Schimmer, du hast mich vernarrt und du hast mich gefangen. The city calls Hofstein with the buzzing of electric wire, drawing him from afar with forces of beauty and gleam, with shimmer. He sees the city on the mountaintop and feels its draw, however, also as if he's been deceived or even captured. Just a few months later, Chaikov would create yet another cover illustration for Peretz Markish's poetry collection, Schwellen, or Thresholds, one of Markish's first breakthrough works that was published in Kyiv in 1919. It's a collection of avant-garde poetry by a young poet, largely inspired by Russian futurist Vladimir Mayakovsky. In this collection, you can see the illustration features what appears to be the same figure, now liberated from the confines of the shtetl and ascending the mountain as the sun remains unobstructed. During this time, civil war and pogroms were ravaging the Ukrainian landscape, leading to the publication of Markish's Die Kuppe, The Mound, one of Markish's most famous works and a seminal work of pogrom poetry. First published in Warsaw in 1921 and in Kyiv a year later, the editions were illustrated by leading Jewish avant-gardists Henryk Berlevi and Iosif Chaikov. Each illustration in its own way embodies the monumentalist aesthetics of Markish's poetics. To explain how these aesthetics work and how they monumentalize the mound, this literal heap of victims to pogrom violence, I'll draw your attention to the opening sonnet. Nit, lek nit chelev himmelscher, meine verpappte Berg, von meiner Mäuler chluipen bräune Ritschkes de Jegets, o bräune Roschena von Bluten von Gesegets. Nit, reer nit das Gebrek auf schwarze Dick von der Erd. A weg, es stinkt von mir, es kriegen auf mir frisch, du suchst dein Tate Mama do, du suchst dein Haver, sie seien do, nur stinkt von seinen Aver. A weg, sie losen sich, sie repeten mit Het, sie beugen wie Mesh. A Kuppe koite gret von unten bis rauf is, na, wo's der Wildsig du Wind, kratzereus und nimm dir, an Keggen sitzt der Kloster wie et Klär, bei Kuppe ausgestickte Eufes, a helevene Himmelin, eik sie lange Jahre die Schabesdicke Hemder, und traut Gesundheit und Naches, alle, Yud Aleph, Tishrei Aleph, Tishrei Tarpa Aleph. So I have here the metrical scansion of this opening sonnet, one that was noticeably difficult to read, a lot of long words with very guttural consonant clusters. And you can see in this metrical stanza scansion of the opening sonnet how the lines elongate, these mixed iambs that grow longer and longer as the canto progresses, resembling the mound itself in its form. The classical genre form of the sonnet, one that's linked to Italian European poetic tradition, is taken by Markish and really used to profane the art of poetic creation itself. This is evident in the rhymes, which you can see on the right in original Yiddish orthography. Actually, when I switch to transliterated Yiddish, it's mainly slides that I've taken from academic presentations in which transliteration is really necessary, but when the orthography is really vital to understanding this work, I included in the original Yiddish. And here we can see, for those who read Yiddish, for those who don't, perfect rhymes at the top. We have the masculine rhyme, Berg and Baird and Erd, the Jegets, Gezegets, Even in the second stanza, fresh mesh, chaver aver, Yiddish Loshen Kodesh word. And then toward the bottom two stanzas, away from the sort of celestial beauty of the higher stanzas to the base of the mound, we have these really odd-looking rhymes with a roifiz and oifiz, nemder and hemder, and ala ala, tarpa aleph, creating this really strange but extremely innovative slant rhyme by Markish, for which he was known and also highly influenced by Vladimir Mayakovsky. And this is just one example in which Markish uses this sort of poetic innovation and also what I consider to be very, very talented formal understandings of poetry, which Markish was often criticized for empty lines and not necessarily being the most formally attentive poet of his time. Instead, I look at him using the formal aspects of verse and poetics to what he would say inspire or invoke a feeling of disgust in his readers and not necessarily pleasure. So this canto becomes monumental in the sense that it actually takes the shape of the mound itself, which brings me back to Berlevi's cover illustration, which was published in Warsaw in 1921. And what's notable about this illustration is you can see how the mound is presented as just one in a series of traumas and instances of pogrom violence, of institutionalized violence by various powers taken against the Jews. And this violence, the mounds, the mountaintops, actually give form to Markish's name, Peretz Markish, and the title of the poema, Die Kuppe, itself. The mound as text becomes monumental, and Markish uses this poema as a way to preserve the memory of pogrom violence in the minds of his readers for years after the actual physical evidence of the mound of this pogrom that occurred in 1920 in the Ukrainian marketplace disappeared. In later cantos, however, Markish suggests that the mound also has this potential to serve as a foundation for revolution, something that is particularly evident in this scene, in which Markish's poetic eye pledges his loyalty to the Malka Kuppe, or sovereign mound. So we see hier, es ist heint a milchige Nacht von eingestellten Kriegele, levone Leib geroten, der schreckt sich nicht aus schwarze Ketz, fahren Ruh mein Tupen, ich gehe euch unsogene Gesiere von der Malke Kuppe, sie schleudert den Berg Sinai, ob zurück die 10 Geboten. Ihr Mäuel sich durstig reichert wie ein Krater als ein Glitter, und treuerig ihr Seuf, gleich wie mit schwarzem Mark versoten. Hey Berg und Marken, auf a Schwur ruf ich mit mein Lied euch, die Kuppe blutig dem Berg Sinai, ob die 10 Geboten. So in this scene, Markish creates this setting that's very reminiscent of that of Exodus 19:8, where Moses receives the 10 Commandments from Adonai, from God on Mount Sinai, and this smoke from the crater rising up like smoke of a kiln as the whole mountain trembles violently. However, here, Markish pledges himself to the mound. He delivers the mound's decree, and he notes how the mound rejects these 10 commandments. Shortly after this canto, Markish's poetic eye appears to align himself with the Bolsheviks through the mound, giving his heart, or a red amulet, the restless red and bloody flag. Mer holem sich Himmel, se flackert mit Träuben, mit tausender Sternen Meiler von Feuglen. Und wer wird sie schneiden, und wer setzt sie gläuben, aus sträfischer Stern von ausgepickt Eug, du suchst die Palonke auf meschene Schneen, auf Brüsten auf meine von blutigen Toll, is na dir mein Herz war a reute Kamaya, die Umruhe gereute, die blutige Fawn. So the restless red and bloody flag is what Markish gives his heart to for the red amulet. In this sense, Markish evokes Chaikov's cover illustration, in which you can see members bringing a body, which is what constructs the mound, which literally pecks out the eye of the sun. And behind you see the restless red bloody flag in the background. This also brings to mind the famous propaganda poster created by Elizitsky, Klinum Krasnim Be Belich, Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge, which was created in Moscow and distributed between 1919 and 1920. This is something that has been observed by other scholars of Soviet Yiddish culture and Soviet Yiddish art, Roy Greenwald among them. But it also has a connection formally to a theory that was defined by Yuri Tynyanov, the famous formalist, Russian formalist, in his 1924 essay Pромежуток, or The Interval, where he says, "И этот гиперболический образ высунет голову из стихов, прорвет их и станет на их место." And the hyperbolic image will stick its head out from the verses, burst through them, and take their place. And here you really have this example in which the mound is coming out from within the confines of the text itself, towards the reader, towards the sun, and becoming this concept of the hyperbolic image defined by Tynyanov, actually used in his analysis of the poetry of Vladimir Mayakovsky. And this illustration also further establishes Markish's poema as a call to action that more definitively links it to the Bolshevik cause. This brings me to sort of the general philosophy that existed among members of the Kultur-lige at the time, which was defined in the pamphlet Was ist die Kultur-lige, which I have here in translation from Hillel Kozlowski. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to personally find a copy of this pamphlet myself, but it clarifies the goals of what the Kultur-lige in Kyiv is trying to do at this time in the 1920s, after the Bolshevik Revolution, but before the formal creation of the Soviet Union. And the writers state that in order to make Jewry a new member of the great community of world culture, there is no need for world culture to be translated into Yiddish, nor is there a need for universal culture to be filtered through the temperament of one specific nation. Much more is required. The new culture has to be transplanted into old soil, thus creating the combination of our history, which is alive in us, and the culture of the modern age. We do not only want to draw on world culture, we also want to contribute to it. We want to contribute not only to new explorers and creators, but also to introduce a new dynamics of exploration, a new original creative rhythm. The Kultur-lige is the expression of a new stream flowing in the great sea of world culture, to which new nuances are added. So the way Markish does this in Die Kupa is by establishing what I refer to as a Kohen Godel mode, the high priest mode or the priestly mode. I also look at what I define and borrow from Dameron as the prophetic mode that Markish would use later, I argue, in his Vertikir Kerman. But in Die Kupa, Markish structures, as others have also noted, the text after a Yom Kippur liturgy. He writes it the day after, dates it the day after Yom Kippur. And it's very symmetrical in the sense that it ends where it begins, with the opening sonnet also functioning as the final sonnet, save the final two stanzas, which we have here. A Kupe koite kret, von unten bis a Reufes, na vos der Wildsig du Wind kratz sich ois, a Kind, a Kala, und kegen sitzt der Kloister wie a Treuer, bei Kupe ausgepickter Eufes, o Chelev in der Himmelin, mir seinen do, mir alle, Yud Aleph, Tishrei Tarpa Aleph, Sugots Nomen, Amen. And what I note here is really the confusion in this final two lines, where we have the date and then zu Gold's nomen, omen, or omen, how to pronounce this. And it really implicates the reader in the profane Yom Kippur liturgy that Markish establishes throughout the course of this text. There's belief in Judaic tradition that one shouldn't pronounce omen curtly, quickly, that you should draw it out. We have an amen, omen. But here, to preserve the rhyme, you're going to want to say zu Gottes nomen, omen. And this is just one way that Markish establishes through the formal aspects of his verse, through the meter, through the rhyme scheme, this disgust and also this sort of trigger to implicate his readers and to drive them into his creative rhythm that he establishes in this sense. I look at poemas as monuments in the way that they proliferate messages out to the world, and I do not have any analyses of cantos from Radio, Markish's subsequent poema illustrated by Markish. But here we can see another very innovative cover illustration created by Henryk Berlewi once again and published in Warsaw. You could see the Polish rodeo transliteration of the Yiddish title, and the way that the title and the author's name, instead of being made from the mountains, instead of being inspired and created by this violence, is now inspired instead by this industrial message of electrification, of radio waves, and of proliferating this message of Bolshevism, of industrial revolution out beyond Ukraine to Poland even. And at this point in time, Markish is living in Poland from 1921 to 1926. He's based out of Warsaw, traveling across Eastern Europe and also to what was then mandatory Palestine, and finally returning to Moscow in 1926. But what's noticeable here is instead of the violence, instead of the mound creating this title out of Jewish suffering, we have this new process of electrification of the products of industrialism proliferating a new message of hope and supporting the Bolshevik, the Soviet movement that's happening eastwards. Chaikov, who had also illustrated many of Markish's collections, other Yiddish literary collections, created a sketch for a sculpture which he would physically create in 1925 called the Electrificator, in which the artist presents an ambiguous, not even sort of human looking, a man that's created from mixed media, from steel, reinforced concrete, brass, a junction box as this product of the creation of Bolshevik work of Soviet industrialism. And what's interesting is Chaikov creates this sketch in 1921, just months after Vladimir Lenin famously noted that communism это есть советская власть plus электрификация всей страны, that communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country. And until this point, Chaikov had focused not primarily, but largely on Jewish figures. He had constructed or sculpted bas reliefs featuring fiddlers, featuring young Jews, and featuring just Jews that are walking in more traditional East European garb at the time. And right around this point, there's a shift to more industrial themes, to creating bridge builders, this electrificator, the electrifier, and other workers of this new Soviet project. This sketch was originally published in Sculptur, which was Chaikov's treatise on Jewish sculpture, on the first text actually to be written about sculpture in Yiddish. And in this text, Chaikov outlines his idea for what he figures will be the new Jewish aesthetic form. And really this electrificator illustration and later statue and this poema illustration per radio sort of shows how these sculptural aesthetics, poetic aesthetics of poetry are developing hand in hand, both in support of this ideology that's becoming established within the Soviet Union, that these Yiddish culturalists are using their avant-garde aesthetics to contribute actively to the development of this ideology and of this aesthetic movement, and also to convince and to bring Eastern European Jews, not just in the territories of the Soviet Union, but beyond, to participate in this Soviet industrial project. In the project that I'm working on, Der Verticator Kerman is really the main piece that I look at least what I looked at in my dissertation, and it's a large part of my current book project. And it's an incredible text that's Markish's self-proclaimed magnum opus, but was never published during the course of his lifetime. He wasn't able to publish it in the course of his lifetime because by 1930, when he largely finished it, there was a much bigger crackdown on freedoms in publishing and poetry and art in the Soviet Union. Socialist realism would be adopted as the state-sponsored aesthetic form just years later in 1932. But Markish, nevertheless, continued to work on this text until the end of his life, until his arrest. And it was published first in Yiddish in Jerusalem, actually, in 1976. And I read Der Verticator Kerman as a text that ritualizes the pursuit of industrial utopia, that it's Markish's way of sort of commentating as it's happening, the developments that lead this transition to not just Jewish participation, but the workers' participation in the creation of an industrial utopian society on the territory of the Soviet Union. And he does this in two ways. One way is formally through his stanza form, meter, rhyme scheme. And the other way is through biblical intertexts and historical intertexts that, again, set the stage for what's happening in the Soviet Union at the time, albeit very ambiguously. It's a tough text to get through, and one that really at times sort of leaves you scratching your head, wondering what's happening. On the screen, I have just the first 4 lines from this long poem, which was 80 cantos in total, each canto being 24 lines, 12 rhyming couplets. And we have Verticator Kerman, sei begrüßt in dein Pein, svette keiner nicht meiden, svette keiner vorbei, auf den Borg von dein Pein, auf den Borg von dein Fried, soll beginnen mein Aufgang, soll aufgehen mein Rei. So 40-year-old man, greet your pain. No one will avoid you. No one will pass you. On the mountain of your pain, on the mountain of your joy, shall my sunrise begin, shall my turn ascend. So this again sort of draws back to the first illustration that I showed, Begin in Dawn, and Hofstein's opening poem, Stolz, with the mountain, the city on the mountain, calling the poetic eye. And I view Markish's Verticator Kerman as this unrealized contribution to the progression of what we see in these collections that were created in a point in time where there's a ton of instability, civil war, pogroms, nothing really established at the moment. And Markish writes Der Verticator Kerman, the man of 40, in 2 parts. The first of which he writes when he's abroad between 1920 and 1926, and the second of which he writes once he returns to the Soviet Union, or to what became the Soviet Union, in 1926 to 1930. And we have the biblical intertext that becomes established in the first part is linked to Deutero-Isaiah, to the Jewish return from Babylonian exile. And Markish, in the first part of this 40-year-old man long poem, has the poetic eye sort of wandering in this wilderness as he seeks to ascend the mountain, presumably to the city, to the factory. He creates at first the intertext through form. We have anapestic tetrameter, which is very important in the context of the poem, in the context of creating this new creative rhythm, as was defined in what is the Kultur-lige, was ist die Kultur-lige. And though it takes a while for the biblical intertext to become apparent through content, we see it immediately through the meter and rhyme scheme, where we have Vertikere Mann, sei begrüßen dein Pein, Anapes, which is 2 unstressed feet followed by 1 stressed metrical foot, and the link to Byron's The Destruction of Sennacherib, also inspired by the book of Isaiah. The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea when the blue wave rolls nightly on deep Galilee. So we have again anapestic tetrameter with masculine rhyme at the end. Pine, Farbai, Fred, Ray, Markish used slant rhymes. Byron used perfect rhymes, fold, gold, sea, Galilee. Nevertheless, masculine rhyming couplets. And while it's unlikely Markish would have read Byron in the original English, there was a very famous Russian translation by Alexei Tolstoy from 1858 that Markish certainly would have been familiar with, that goes, Syrianie shli, kak nastada valki, pagretse ich zlate siyali palki, I bezshota ich kapia serkali akrest, kak valnach galaleskich mertsania svest. So valki, palki, akrest, zvest, the similar scheme that establishes this biblical intertext with Isaiah, and shows again how Markish creates this creative rhythm for his readers. And Anapes is also known as galloping meter, simulating the galloping trots of the horse, also being similar to the steps of ascension, of climbing a mountain. So basically, as I mentioned, this poem establishes, and I know it's a very long poem, I don't have time to go through the entire 80 cantos, unfortunately, but in the first part, we have entirely Anapes, one rhythm of sort of search for this, for the factory, to search for this destination that Markish's poetic eye is looking for the 40-year-old man, for this area that at first is very abstract and not clearly designed or defined. However, in the second part, the destination really becomes overlaid gradually with Soviet topography. There's references to developments happening in the Soviet Union, phrases from the Pionieri, the Soviet pioneers, the youth movement, sort of like the Soviet Boy Scouts that Markish uses in his verse. And he gradually shifts his meter from the anapestic tetrameter in the first part, which the first part's written almost exclusively in Anapes, again, this meter of ascension, of galloping, to amphibrachic tetrameter in the second part. And I have here, just for demonstration in the context of this talk, lines from the final canto, the 80th canto of the poem. O dort wo ein Oxford geschleppt sich in Joch, so laufen et Traktor a Sveter und noch. Und räufen sich Koimenes über in der Heuch, der Jogen die Hand von Bedarf und Gebräuch. Es soll sich vermessen auf Gold und Farzer, mit Warstadt a Warstadt und et segnet das Sek, und es wird der vermisst, nicht gestillt und nicht satt, a Zeck mit der Zeck, mit Verstadt und Verstadt. And I have bold in bold here these two lines, mit Verstadt, a Verstadt, und a Zeck mit der Zeck, with workbench, a workbench, and workshop with a workshop. Not very poetic, but what's important is the meter here, mit Verstadt, a Verstadt, and a pes that are replaced at the end, where we have this flip, a workshop with a workshop, with a workbench, a workbench, a Zech mit the Zech, mit Verstadt, a Verstadt, to the amphibrachts, which establish this more industrialized rhythm that we see in the second part and suggests this new creative rhythm that the Kultur-lige was trying to establish and defined in their pamphlet, Was ist die Kultur-lige? Unfortunately, I am not going to be able to share the full video, but I have here a still from the propaganda film Yevrei na Zemlya, or Jews on the Land, which was directed by Abram Rom, one of the most famous Soviet directors of the 1920s, also a Jewish director, a Soviet Jewish director, famous for Bed and Sofa, which is one of the more important contributions to silent film, not just in the Soviet Union, but in the world in the 1920s. Yevrei na Zemlya, though, is a very propagandistic film or documentary film, in which the developments of the Jewish settlement project in the Crimean Peninsula are laid out. And in this film, which was released in 1927, we have an image of the tractors going one after another, and also the ox trudging in burden. We see the ox being replaced by the tractor, and the tractors at the end of the scene are going out very synchronously in what appears to be this new rhythm mimicking Markish's amphibrachts at the end of the poem. So just an example of how it's not just poetry and sculpture, poetry and art that are aligning to create this new aesthetic for not just Soviet Jews, but the new Soviet workers in total, but film as well. This is a cover illustration for Еврейский крестьянин, or the Jewish poet, or Jewish peasant, which was an almanac that also basically just went through the progress that is being made in the Jewish settlement project of the Crimean Peninsula. And as you can see, we have this, what I call a stock image of the Soviet Jewish worker with his hat, with his tractor, that is essentially just the same exact Soviet Jew that is depicted in Abram Rom's Yevrei na Zemlya, and also the poetic eye that is narrating Markish's Vertigitter Kerman, who stands out and witnesses this tractor going one after another. Interestingly enough, in Yevrei na Zemlya, there's been scholarship that likens this protagonist, the old Jewish figure, to the Moses figure. And a lot of the film covers the irrigation processes that brought water to the Crimean Peninsula and the ways that the workers are able to use water to move water in order to make the Crimean Peninsula this fertile and livable area for East Europe's Jewish population at the time. Interestingly, in this photo, the Jewish farmer, the Jewish peasant, the Christianin, isn't red, the tractor is. And this really represents this process of becoming Soviet, the fact that Yevreisky, Jewish, is written in red as well, that the work that the Jew does in Crimea, in the Soviet Union, will ultimately turn the Soviet Jew into the Soviet citizen. I have here just two illustrations to show what's going on at this point in time in 1926 and in 1927, really just to point out that and emphasize that this is a time where there's still a lot of creative freedom in the Soviet Union. Abram Rom directed Tretya Mashanskaya, in direct translation would be the third Mashanskaya or Bed and Sofa, which, as I mentioned, is a really hallmark film about NEP area Moscow that describes a sort of love triangle, a threesome menage a trois, if you will, and commentates on the ways in which daily life in Moscow is really not what it should be and what was promised under the Soviet Union. It's critical of the Soviet Union, and it is also a film of sexual liberation and of women's independence, which made it extremely daring for its time. And also on the right, a cover illustration for the only Hebrew language literary journal to be typeset in the Soviet Union. You can see on the bottom, we have Leningrad and Moskva, the journal Bereshit. It couldn't be published in the Soviet, or couldn't be printed in the Soviet Union. It had to be printed in Berlin. However, there were examples of this, or copies of this Hebrew language journal that were released in Moscow and in Berlin, or in Leningrad in 1926 even, which is pretty shocking. Also, the illustrator of this image was none other than Iosif Chaikov. Which brings me, finally, we don't have too much time left, but to Chaikov's involvement in monumentalizing Soviet ideology, Soviet industrial utopianism, not just for Jews, but for all Soviet minorities and Soviet workers. As I mentioned at first, he started really focusing on Jewish figures, on Jewish subjects. These fiddler bas reliefs are two of his early works from 1921 and 1922. And they were published in, or the first one on the left was published in his treatise Sculptor. And in this treatise, as I mentioned, he lays out his vision for the development of a new Jewish aesthetic form. And one of the most notable lines in this treatise is Die nationale Schaffung drückt sich nicht aus in der ethnographischen Inhalt, or national creation does not express itself in its ethnographic contents. And this really sort of epitomizes the trend that I was trying to establish throughout this talk, in the sense that we see the beginning cover illustration where the shtetl Jew is shedding his ethnographic identifiers and ascending this mountain really as this naked figure going eastward towards the sunrise, towards the dawn, towards this, at the time, unestablished Soviet Union that is in the process of its creation and its development. Chaikov would continue to work on developing a more Soviet aesthetic form. He really, unlike Markish, abandoned all links to his Jewish identity once he returned to the Soviet Union, or moved permanently to Moscow in 1923. He moved earlier, and he immediately became established in this process of creating the Soviet aesthetic ideology. He worked at Vchutemas, the higher School of Artistic Education, with Vera Muchina, where he taught sculpture, and was a very prolific Soviet sculptor, known much more for his works of Soviet art than for his avant-garde creations, for his Jewish creations. Not most notably, but one of his most notable contributions was the propylaea, which led to the Soviet Pavilion at the World's Fair in 1937 in Paris. And I don't have it in this image on the right, but there was a massive confrontation aesthetically in the pavilion, where you have the Eiffel Tower would be somewhere here, and the Nazi pavilion immediately opposite the Soviet pavilion, Albert Speer's Nazi pavilion, where you have this clash of German fascism, of Nazi German fascism, with Soviet communism, setting the stage for World War II. Chaikov's reliefs are really thematically linked by this idea of the friendship of peoples that Stalin was trying to promote in 1937 to inspire participation in the Soviet project from all nations of the Soviet Union, from the Belarusian SSSR to the Armenian SSSR, the Soviet Socialist Republic. And while Mukhina's worker and peasant woman, which is the statue on top of the pavilion, symbolizes the unity of the worker and peasant, so too do Chaikov's bas reliefs, which also aim to symbolize the ethnographic diversity and the general diversity among the Soviet Union. My argument is that Chaikov's depictions of these various Soviet nationals actually manipulate this idea of diversity and use it to serve the Soviet Union and this sort of captured Soviet ideology, that the initial optimism that Markish once had, that Chaikov had when they first moved to the Soviet Union, has been repurposed to serve ideology and an industrial utopianism that's been co-opted by the Soviet Stalinist regime. And I'm going to have to wrap up quickly, I think, because of time. But basically what happens is shortly after World War II, or shortly after the Paris Exposition, World War II begins, the Nazis invade France, and the worker and kolkhoz woman was actually shipped back to Moscow after the exposition, while Chaikov's bas reliefs stayed at the propylaea themselves, the monumental gates, stayed in Paris and were actually sent to Ballet in France, the chateau at Ballet in France, which was used by a French workers' union as a vacation area during this time when France was under a socialist government, a sign of goodwill between the Soviets and the French. When the Nazis invaded, they destroyed the propylaea and buried them underground. They saw the Soviet iconography, and the propylaea and Chaikov's reliefs were only rediscovered in 2004. And here we see the fragments of these shattered reliefs and a fiddler, who I argue is really a progression and perhaps a final progression in this evolution of the Soviet Jew, who began perhaps as this really undefined, but more sort of traditional in terms of the image, in terms of traditional garb of the Jewish figure, into the abstract, nationless figure with no ethnographic signification whatsoever, and into what we see as this fully actualized Soviet citizen who, while not necessarily Jewish, is playing a fiddle and really serves as this final stage of the progression in Chaikov's work. And finally, one last image that I want to share is Chaikov's Человек, human or person, which he created in 1968. And as I mentioned, this is an artist who really abandoned any connection to his Jewish heritage, really from 1923 onward. However, in 1968, 1 year after the Six-Day War, Chaikov creates this sculpture that is undeniably inspired by a figure of Jewish nationhood, a symbol of Jewish nationhood, I should say, the menorah, which anyone would have known at this time, even in the Soviet Union, that had become the national symbol of the state of Israel. But he links it to something that's really inherent to all humanity. We have this naked figure, once again, appears to be an uncircumcised naked figure, curiously enough, and sort of Soviet-fashioned figures standing on the branches of the menorah with a couple embracing together under a globe. Unfortunately, this statue is actually, or the sculpture is, it's unknown where it is currently, which I'm very upset about. It's likely somewhere in Moscow or Russia. but it would be great to be able to have a better look at this. And with Chaikov himself, the real tragedy in terms of what we know about him is he lived until 1979, and this was largely because he was so hesitant to share any aspects or any conversation about his former life as a Yiddish avant-gardist, as someone who played such a vital role in the development of Jewish aesthetics. And he's one who survived in part because, unlike Markish, unlike writers, wasn't putting words on the page and just creating statues that were able to go sort of under the radar. So I think that's all for now. Thank you.
Dank, Roy. Thanks a lot. Roy, von das, was ich weiß, er ist geboren geworden wie ein Amerikaner und sich ausgeholt wird auf Englisch, ja. Jahren später hat er gelernt, sei Jiddisch, sei Russisch. Russisch hat er auch gelernt in Moskau. Und heutzutage brecht er sich die Zähne mit Hebräisch. Noch einmal, es gewesen so schön zu sehen, die Poesie zusammen mit allen Illustrations. It was very nice to see all the poetry from Peretz Markish, for example, and the illustrations, because it shows how the movement was so wide that our Jews wanted to be part of the Soviet revolution, yes, in poetry, in pictures, in theater, and so on and so on. Sometimes struggling also to define themselves as Jews. Now we can have a short time if people have questions. If someone wants, he can raise his hand and push it up auf euer Hand und ihr könnt fragen.
Pierre. Yeah.
Okay,
Pierre, very good. Pierre,
yeah, so thank you very much. I have been very interested in Peretz Markish's poetry, and especially the coupe, and even the epigraph. That's a small question. Do you know, is there an epigraph to the Kyiv 1922 edition, which a person quotes from El Asar El Hanan, but I didn't find this epigraph to that one, to that version, only to the 1921 version. So that's a little technical question. But then I want also to remind of the cycle Chatterdag, which he wrote a little earlier, and it's also about Crimea. And so is there anything Soviet and this irrigation and these themes in Chatterdag as it? So that's my two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. In terms of the epigraph, I know where he says to the Jews in Ukraine, or to the victims in Ukraine, in the Polish addiction. And it's been a while since I have consulted both. I don't remember actually if there appeared the epigraph in the 1922 Ukrainian edition. I would have to reconsult that. And also in terms of the link to Crimea as well and irrigation, as far as I know, there wasn't a reference to this in Markish's pre-Soviet work. However, in Der Vertikere Kerman, and again in sort of this Isaiah intertext of God moving mountains, God moving rivers and waters to make the path of the Jews easier back to the promised land. In the Vertikere Kerman, there's a lot of instances in which the workers themselves are moving the mountains or digging into the earth. And really, Markish accentuates the violence of this process and really frames it as an almost sexualized assault of the earth, where dig mine shafts to extract resources. And he portrays the earth really as a victim of rape in really the only way to put it at the end. And it's, again, a way that a reason why Markish obviously couldn't publish Der Verzerkehrer Kerman in the Soviet Union. And he's aware of this fact. And sorry, this doesn't really answer the question about the earlier cycle, but he definitely brings up, in my reading in The 40-Year-Old Man, this idea of, again, it doesn't necessarily have to do with Crimea either, but moving water, moving resources and extracting these resources from the earth and really taking the power that was once believed to reside in only God alone and bestowing it to the worker and to the workers that are coming to build the factory and establish these metallurgical plants, essentially.
Okay, so Chatterdag is more idyllic. Maybe it's not about industrialization and such, but there is you can see the mountain, big mountain Chatterdag as similarity to the Mount Sinai, maybe.
Thank you. I'll definitely have to take a look at that as well. A lot to think about.
Eli Walk
Yes.
will also say a word.
Yes, I would like to make 2 points. First of all, Roy Ginsberg, I appreciate very much the efforts you invested in preparing and showing us illustrations. It was a very important to see, not just to hear you, but to see illustrations. And I want to relate to one of the illustrations where you showed the symbol of the Belarusian Soviet Republic. It was the only Soviet Republic where the words proletariat of all Länder get united was written in 4 languages, because in Belarus were 4 minorities. One of the languages was Yiddish, and it's the only place where Yiddish was on the official Gerbonis semel of the Soviet Republic. And this was very much later, in 1993, 94, 5, when I was the first Israeli ambassador in Minsk. This was stressed by Belarusian Jews, and not only Jews. It was stressed by them that Belarus is a place where Jewish culture and Jewish language flourished. Thank you.
Thank you, Eli Walk. And we are finishing right now. We can stay here, of course, but the formal recording will finish. Thank you all. Thank you, Roy Ginsberg, for this nice lecture, and that is part of us. And let's hope in the future to hear you again. You are staying with us in Israel. We would like you to hear you once again in Hebrew, in Yiddish, in Russian, and in English. A Buch ist eine wichtige Institution.
Thank you.